The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 1, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 11, Side 1. Aldous worked at his enterprise quite literally night and day. Those who cultivate letters, he wrote in his preface to Aristotle's Organon, must be supplied with the books necessary for their purpose, and until this supply is secured, I shall not rest. Over the door of his study he placed a warning inscription. Whoever thou art earnestly requested by Aldous to state thy business briefly, and to take thy departure promptly, for this is a place of work. He was so absorbed in his publishing campaign that he neglected his family and his friends, and ruined his health. 1,000 tribulations sapped his energy. Strikes disrupted his schedule. War suspended it for a year during the Venetian struggle for survival against the League of Cambrai. Rival printers in Italy, France, and Germany pirated the editions whose manuscripts had cost him dearly and whose texts he had paid scholars to revise. But the sight of his small and handy volumes, clearly typed and neatly bound, going forth to a widening public at a modest price, about $2 in the currency of today, gladdened his heart and repaid his toil. Now, he told himself, the glory of Greece would shine upon all who cared to receive it. Inspired by his devotion, Venetian scholars joined with him to found the Nea Academia, or New Academy, in 1500, dedicated to the acquisition, editing, and publishing of Greek literature. The members, at their meetings, spoke only Greek. They changed their names to Greek forms. They shared the tasks of editing. Distinguished men labored in this academy: Bembo, Alberto Pio, Erasmus of Holland, Linacre of England. Aldous gave them much credit for the success of his enterprise, but it was his own energy and passion that carried it through. He died exhausted and poor in 1515, but fulfilled. His sons continued the work, but when their son, Aldo II, died in 1597, the firm dissolved. It had served its purpose faithfully. It had taken Greek literature from the half-hidden shelves of rich collectors and had scattered it so widely that even the ravaging of Italy in the third decade of the 16th century and the desolation of northern Europe by the 30 Years' War could lose that heritage as it had been so largely lost in the dying ages of ancient Rome. 2. Bembo. Besides helping to revive the literature of Greece, the members of the New Academy contributed vigorously to the literature of their time. Antonio Coccio, called Sibyllicus, chronicled Venetian history in his Decades. Andrea Navaggero composed Latin poems so nearly perfect in form that his proud countrymen hailed him as having snatched the leadership of letters from Florence to Venice. Marino Sanudo kept a lively diary of current events in politics, literature, art, manners, and morals. The 58 volumes of these diarii picture the life of Venice more fully and vividly than any history of any city in Italy. Sanudo wrote in the racy language of daily speech. His friend Bembo devoted half a long life to polishing an artificial style in Latin and Italian. Pietro imbibed culture in his cradle, for he was the child of rich and lettered Venetians. Moreover, as if to confirm his literary purity, he was born in Florence, proud home of the Tuscan dialect. He studied Greek in Sicily under Constantine Lascaris, and philosophy at Padua under Pomponazzi. Perhaps, if we may judge from his conduct, for he seldom took sin very seriously, he imbibed some skepticism from Pomponazzi, who doubted the immortality of the soul. But he was too much of a gentleman to disturb the consolations of the faith, and when the reckless professor was accused of heresy, Bembo persuaded Leo X to deal with him leniently. Bembo's happiest days were spent at Ferrara, from his 28th to his 36th year, from 1498 to 1506. There he fell in love, if only in a literary way, with Lucrezia Borgia, queen of that courtly court. He forgot her dubious background at Rome in the lure of her quiet grace, the glow of her Titian hair, the fascination of her fame. For fame, too, like beauty, can intoxicate. He wrote her in scholarly diction letters as tender as might comport with his safety in the precincts of that excellent gunner, her husband Alfonso. He dedicated to her an Italian dialogue on Platonic love, Gli Azzolani, in 1505. and he composed in her praise Latin elegiacs as elegant as any in Rome's Silver Age. She wrote to him carefully, and may have sent him that tress of her hair which is preserved with her letters to him in the Ambrosian Library at Milan. When Bembo moved from Ferrara to Urbino in 1506, he was at the height of his charm. He was tall and handsome, of noble birth and breeding, of distinguished presence, without obtrusive pride. He could write poetry in 3 languages, and his letters were already prized. His conversation was that of a Christian, a scholar, and a gentleman. His Azzolani, published during his stay at Urbino, fell in with the spirit of that court. What topic could be more pleasant than love? What mise-en-scène fitter for such discourse than the gardens of Caterina Cornaro at Asolo? What occasion more suitable than the wedding of one of her maids of honor? Who could better speak of love, however platonic, than the 3 youths and 3 maidens into whose mouths Bembo put his savory mixture of philosophy and poetry? Venice, whose artists took hints and scenes from the book; Ferrara, whose duchess received the adoring dedication; Rome, where ecclesiastics were glad ragionar d'amore; Urbino, which boasted the author in the flesh. All Italy acclaimed Bembo as a master of delicate sentiment and polished style. When Castiglione idealized the courtier in discussions he had heard or imagined in the ducal palace at Urbino, he gave to Bembo the most distinguished role in the dialogue, and chose him to phrase the famed concluding passages on Platonic love. In 1512, Bembo accompanied Giuliano de' Medici to Rome. A year later, Giuliano's brother became Leo X. Bembo was soon lodged in the Vatican as a secretary to the Pope. Leo liked his wit, his Ciceronian Latin, his easygoing ways. For 7 years, Bembo was an ornament of the papal court, an idol of society, an intellectual father to Raphael, a favorite with millionaires and generous women. He was only in minor orders, and accepted the opinion current in Rome that his trial marriage with the Church did not forbid a little gracious venery. Vittoria Colonna, purest of the pure, doted on him. Meanwhile, at Venice, Ferrara, Urbino, Rome, he wrote such Latin poetry as Catullus or Tibullus might have penned. Elegies, idylls, epitaphs, odes. Many frankly pagan, some, like his Priapus, in the best vein of Renaissance licentiousness. The Latin of Bembo and Politian was idiomatically perfect, but it came at the wrong time. Had they been born 14 centuries earlier, they would have been de rigueur in the schools of modern Europe. Writing in the 15th and 16th centuries, they could not be the voice of their country, their epoch, even of their class. Bembo realized this, and in an essay, Della Volgar Lingua, he defended the use of Italian for literary purposes. He tried to show the way by composing canzoni in the manner of Petrarch, but here his passion for polish devitalized his verse and turned his amours into poetic conceits. Nevertheless, many of these poems were set to music as madrigals, some by the great Palestrina himself. The sensitive Bembo found Rome a ghostly city after the death of his friends Bibbiena, Chigi, and Raphael. He retired from his papal post in 1520, and, like Petrarch, sought health and ease in a rural home near Padua. Now, at 50, he fell in love in no mild Platonic way. For the next 22 years he lived in a free union with Donna Morosina, who gave him not only 3 children, but such comforts and consolations, such solicitude and care as had never graced his fame, and now came doubly welcome to his declining years. He still enjoyed the income of several ecclesiastical benefices. He used his wealth largely to collect fine paintings and sculptures, and among them Venus and Jove held an honored place beside Mary and Christ. His home became a goal of literary pilgrimage, a salon of artists and wits, and from that throne he laid down the laws of style for Italy. Even while papal secretary, he had cautioned his associate Sadoleto to avoid reading the epistles of St. Paul, lest their unpolished speech of the commonalty should mar his taste. "Put away these trifles," Bembo told him, "for such absurdities do not become a man of dignity." All Latin, he told Italy, must be modeled upon Cicero, all Italian upon Petrarch and Boccaccio. He himself, in his old age, wrote histories of Florence and Venice. They are beautiful and dead. But when his Morosina died, the great stylist forgot his rules, forgot Plato and Lucrezia and Castiglione, and wrote to a friend a letter that, perhaps alone of all that flowed from his pen, invites remembrance. I have lost the dearest heart in the world, a heart which tenderly watched over my life, which loved it and sustained it neglectful of its own, a heart so much the master of itself, so disdainful of vain embellishments and adornments, of silk and gold, of jewels and treasures of price, that it was content with the single and, so she assured me, supreme joy of the love I bore it. This heart, moreover, had for vesture the softest, gracefulest, daintiest of limbs. It had at its service pleasant features and the sweetest, most graciously endowed form that I have ever met in this land. He can never forget her dying words. I recommend our children to you, and beseech you to have care for them, both for my sake and for yours. Be sure they are your own, for I have never deceived you. That is why I could take our Lord's body just now with a soul at peace. Then, after a long pause, she added, Rest with God, and a few minutes afterward closed her eyes forever, those eyes that had been the clear, shining, faithful stars of my weary pilgrimage through life. 4 years later, he was still mourning her. Losing his ties with life, he became pious at last, and in 1539 Paul III could make him a priest and a cardinal. For his remaining 8 years he was a pillar and exemplar of the Church. 7. Verona. If now, leaving the egregious Aretino to a later chapter, we move out of Venice to her northern and western dependencies, we should find there, too, some radiance of the Golden Age. Treviso could boast that it had begotten Lorenzo Lotto and Paris Bordone, and its cathedral had an Annunciation by Titian and a fine choir designed by the innumerable Lombardi. The little town of Pordenone gave its name to Giovanni Antonio de Sacchi, and still shows in its Duomo one of his chefs-d'oeuvre, a Madonna with saints and donor. Giovanni was a man of buoyant energy and self-confidence, ready of wit and sword, willing to undertake anything anywhere. We find him painting in Udine, Spilimbergo, Treviso, Vicenza, Ferrara, Mantua, Cremona, Piacenza, Genoa, Venice, forming his style on Giorgione's landscapes, Titian's architectural backgrounds, and Michelangelo's muscles. He gladly accepted an invitation to Venice in 1527, anxious to pit his brush against Titian's. His St. Martin and St. Christopher, painted for the Church of San Rocco, achieved an almost sculptural effect by modeling with light and shade. Venice hailed him as a worthy rival of Titian. Pordenone resumed his travels, married thrice, and was suspected of killing his brother, was knighted by King John of Hungary, who had never seen any of his pictures, and returned to Venice in 1533 to resume his duel with Titian. Hoping to prod Titian on to finishing his battle picture in the ducal palace, the Signory engaged Pordenone to do a panel on the opposite wall. The competition between Leonardo and Michelangelo was here repeated in 1538, with a dramatic supplement. Pordenone wore a sword at his belt. His canvas, splendid in color, too violent in action, was adjudged second best, and Pordenone moved on to Ferrara to design some tapestries for Ercole II. 2 weeks after arrival, he died. His friends said it was poisoning. His enemies said it was time. Vicenza, too, had heroes. Bartolomeo Montagna founded a school of painting rich in middling Madonnas. Montagna's best is the Madonna enthroned in the Brera. It cleaves safely to Antonello's model of 2 saints on the right, 2 on the left, and angels making music at the Virgin's feet. But these angels deserve their name, and the Virgin, with comely features and graceful robe, is one of the finest figures in the crowded gallery of Renaissance Madonnas. Vicenza's heyday, however, awaited Palladio. Verona, after a proud history of 1,500 years, became a Venetian dependency in 1404, and remained so till 1796. Nevertheless, she had a healthy cultural life of her own. Her painters fell behind those of Venice, but her architects, sculptors, and woodworkers were not surpassed in the most serene capital. The 14th-century tombs of the Scaligers, though too ornate, suggest no lack of sculptors, and the equestrian statue of Can Grande della Scala, with the flowing caparison of the horse so vividly portraying motion, falls short only of the masterpieces of Donatello and Verrocchio. The most sought-for wood carver in Italy was Fra Giovanni da Verona. He worked in many cities, but he devoted a large part of his life to carving and inlaying the choir stalls of Santa Maria in Organo in his native city. The great name in Veronese architecture was that rare and universal genius, Vasari calls him, Fra Giocondo. Hellenist, botanist, antiquarian, philosopher, and theologian, this remarkable Dominican friar was also one of the leading architects and engineers of his time. He taught Latin and Greek to the famous scholar Julius Caesar Scaliger, who practiced medicine in Verona before moving to France. Fra Giocondo copied the inscriptions on the classic remains in Rome and presented a book on the subject to Lorenzo de' Medici. His researches led to the discovery of the greater part of Pliny's letters in an old collection in Paris. While in that city, he built 2 bridges over the Seine. When the detritus of the river Brenta threatened to fill up the lagoons that made Venice possible, Fra Giocondo persuaded the signory to order, at great cost, the diversion of the river to empty farther south. But for this procedure, Venice would not be today a miracle of liquid streets. Hence, Luigi Cornaro called Giocondo the second founder of the city. In Verona, his masterpiece is the Palazzo del Consiglio, a simple Romanesque loggia surmounted by an elegant cornice and crowned with statues of Cornelius Nepos, Catullus, Vitruvius, Pliny the Younger, and Aemilius Macer, all ancient gentlemen of Verona. In Rome, Giocondo was made architect of St. Peter's with Raphael and Giuliano da San Gallo, but died in that year, 1514, aged 81. It was a well-spent life. Giocondo's work on the ruins of Rome excited another Veronese architect. Giovan Maria Falconetto, after drawing all the antiquities of his own locality, marched off to Rome to do the same thing there, and devoted 12 years on and off to the task. Returning to Verona, he took the losing side in politics and had to move to Padua. There, Bembo and Cornaro encouraged him in the application of classical design to architecture, and the generous centenarian housed, fed, financed, and loved Giovan Maria to the end of the artist's 67 years. Falconetto designed a loggia for Cornaro's palace in Padua, 2 of that city's gates, and the church of Santa Maria delle Grazie. Giocondo, Falconetto, and San Michele constituted a trio of architects rivaled only in Rome. Michele San Michele gave himself chiefly to fortification. Son and nephew of Veronese architects, he went to Rome at 16 and carefully measured the ancient buildings. After making a name for himself in designing churches and palaces, he was sent by Clement VII to build defenses for Parma and Piacenza. The distinguishing feature of his military architecture was the pentagonal bastion, from whose projecting balcony guns could be fired in 5 directions. When he examined the fortifications of Venice, he was arrested as a spy, but his examiners were so impressed by his knowledge that the signory engaged him to construct fortresses in Verona, Brescia, Zara, Corfu, Cyprus, and Crete. Back in Venice, he built a massive fort on the Lido. In preparing for the foundations, he soon struck water. Following the example of Fra Giocondo, he sank a double cordon of connected piles, pumped the water from between the 2 circles, and set the foundations on this dry ring. It was a hazardous undertaking, whose success was in doubt to the last minute. Critics predicted that when heavy artillery should be fired from this fort, the structure would shake itself loose from its foundations and collapse. The signory placed in it the stoutest cannon in Venice and ordered them all fire at once. Pregnant women fled from the neighborhood to avoid premature deliveries. The cannon were fired, the fort stood firm, the mothers returned, and San Michele was the toast of Venice. In Verona he designed 2 majestic city gates, adorned with Doric columns and cornices. Vasari ranked these structures, architecturally, with the Roman theater and amphitheater that had survived in Verona from Roman days. He built the Palazzo Bevilacqua there, and the Grimani and Mocenigo palaces. He reared a campanile for the cathedral and a dome for San Giorgio Maggiore. His friend Vasari tells us that, though Michele in youth had indulged in some moderate adultery, he became in later life a model Christian, taking no thought for material gains and treating all men with kindness and courtesy. He bequeathed his skills to Jacopo Sansovino and a nephew whom he loved exceedingly. When news came to him that this nephew had fallen in Cyprus while fighting for Venice against the Turks, San Michele developed a fever and died in a few days, aged 73. This in 1559. To Verona belonged the finest medalist of the Renaissance, perhaps of all time. Antonio Pisano, known to history as Pisanello, always signed himself Pictor and thought of himself as a painter. Half a dozen of his paintings survive, and they are of excellent quality. But it is not these that have sustained his name through the centuries. Recapturing the skill and compact realism of Greek and Roman coin designs, Pisanello molded little circular reliefs, seldom more than 2 inches in diameter, combining finesse of workmanship with such fidelity to truth that his medallions are the most trustworthy representations we have of several Renaissance notables. These are not profound works. They have no philosophical overtones, but they are treasures of painstaking workmanship and historical illumination. Excepting Pisanello and the Carottos, Verona, in painting, remained medieval. After the fall of the Scaligers, it subsided quietly into a secondary role. It was not like Venice or Rialto, where merchants from a dozen lands rubbed elbows and faiths and wore out one another's dogmas with mutual attrition. It was not like Lodovico's Milan, a political power, nor like Florence, a focus of finance, nor like Rome, an international house. It was not so close to the Orient, nor so captivated by humanism as to tincture its Christianity with paganism. It continued content with medieval themes, and rarely reflected in its art the sensuous zest that evoked the nudes of Giorgione and Titian, Correggio and Raphael. In a later period, one of its sons, who indeed is known by its name, entered gaily into the pagan mood. But Paolo Veronese became in life a Venetian rather than a Veronese. Verona was becalmed. In the 14th century, its painters were still abreast of their times. Note how Padua called one of them Altichiero d'Ezevio to decorate the chapel of San Giorgio. Toward the end of that century, Stefano d'Ezevio went to Florence and learned the Giottesque tradition from Agnolo Gaddi. Returning to Verona, he painted frescoes that Donatello pronounced the best yet done in those parts. His pupil, Domenico Morone, advanced upon him by studying the works of Pisanello and the Bellini. The defeat of the Buonaccorsi in the Castello at Mantua emulates the multitudinous panoramas of Gentile. Domenico's son Francesco, by his murals, helped Fra Giovanni's woodwork to make the sacristy of Santa Maria in Organo one of the treasure rooms of Italy. Domenico's pupil, Girolamo dai Libri, at the age of 16, in 1490, painted in the same favorite church an altarpiece, Deposition from the Cross, which, when uncovered, reports Vasari, excited such wonder that the whole city ran to congratulate the artist's father. Its landscape was one of the best in 15th century art. In another of Girolamo's pictures, a tree was so realistically portrayed that, on the word of a holy Dominican, birds tried to perch on its branches, and the grave Vasari himself avers that in a nativity that Girolamo painted for Santa Maria in Organo, you might count the hairs on the rabbits. Girolamo's father had received the name Dai Libri from his skill in illuminating manuscripts. The son carried on the art and came to excel in it all other miniaturists in Italy. About 1462, Jacopo Bellini painted in Verona. One of the boys who served him was Liberale, who later received the name of his city. Through this Liberale da Verona, a touch of Venetian color and vitality entered Veronese painting. Liberale, like Girolamo, found that he prospered best by illuminating manuscripts. He earned 800 crowns, or about $20,000, in Siena by his miniatures. Badly treated in his old age by his married daughter, he bequeathed his estate to his pupil Francesco Torbido, who went to live with him, and died at the reasonable age of 85 in 1536. Torbido studied also with Giorgione, and improved upon Liberale, who forgave him. Another of Liberale's pupils, Giovan Francesco Carotto, was strongly influenced by Mantegna's masterly polyptych in San Zeno. He went to Mantua to study with the old master, and made such progress that Mantegna sent out Carotto's work as his own. Giovan Francesco made excellent portraits of Guidobaldo and Elisabetta, Duke and Duchess of Urbino. He returned to Verona a rich man, who could afford now and then to speak his mind. When a priest accused him of making lascivious figures, he asked, "If painted figures move you so, how can you be trusted with flesh and blood?" He was among the few Veronese painters who wandered from religious themes. If to these men we add Francesco Bonsignori, Paolo Morando, called Cavazzolo, Domenico Brusasorci, and Giovanni Carotto, Giovan Francesco's younger brother, the roster of Veronese painters in the Renaissance is relatively complete. They were almost all good men. Vasari has a moral pat on the back for nearly every one of them. Their lives were orderly for artists, and their work had a placid and wholesome beauty that reflected their natures and their environment. Verona sang a pious and tranquil minor chord in the song of the Renaissance. Chapter 12. Emilia and the Marches, 1378 to 1534. 1. Correggio. 50 miles south of Verona one comes to the old Via Emilia, or Emilian Way, which ran 175 miles from Piacenza through Parma, Reggio, Modena, Bologna, Imola, Forli, and Cesena to Rimini. We pass over Piacenza, and for the moment Parma, to note a little commune 8 miles northeast of Reggio and sharing its name. Correggio is one of several towns in Italy that are remembered only through some genius to whom they gave a cognomen. Its ruling family also was called Correggio. One member was the Niccolo da Correggio, who wrote genteel verses for Beatrice and Isabella d'Este. It was a place where you might expect genius to be born and to die, but not to stay, for it had no significant art or clear tradition to give to ability, instruction, and form. But in the first decades of the 16th century, the House of Correggio was headed by Count Gilbert X and his wife Veronica Gambara, one of the great ladies of the Renaissance. She could speak Latin, knew scholastic philosophy, wrote a commentary on patristic theology, composed delicate Petrarchian verses, was called the 10th Muse. She made her little court a salon for artists and poets, and helped to spread that romantic worship of woman which was now replacing, among the upper classes of Italy, the medieval worship of Mary, and was molding Italian art toward the representation of feminine charms. On September 3, 1528, she wrote to Isabella d'Este that our Messer Antonio Allegri has just finished a masterpiece picturing Magdalene in the desert and expressing in full the sublime art of which he is a great master. It was this Antonio Allegri who unwittingly stole the name and made the fame of his town, though his family name might well have expressed the joyous nature of his art. His father was a small landed proprietor, prosperous enough to win for his son a bride with a dowry of 257 ducats, or about $6,425. When Antonio showed a flair for drawing and painting, he was apprenticed to his uncle Lorenzo Allegri. Who taught him further we do not know. Some say that he went to Ferrara to study with Francesco de Bianchi Ferrari, then to the studios of Francia and Costa at Bologna, then with Costa to Mantua, where he felt the influence of the massive frescoes of Mantegna. In any case, he spent most of his life in Correggio in comparative obscurity, and presumably he was the only one in the town who suspected that he would be ranked among the immortals. He seems to have studied the engravings that Marcantonio Raimondi had made from Raphael, and probably saw, if only in copy, the chief works of Leonardo. All these influences entered into his completely individual style. The sequence of his subjects corresponds to the decline of religion among the literate classes of Italy in the first quarter of the 16th century and the rise of secular patronage and themes. His early works, even when painted for private purchasers, told again, and mostly for churches, the Christian story. The Adoration of the Magi, where the Virgin has the pretty girlish face that Correggio later confined to subordinate characters. The Holy Family, the Madonna of St. Francis, still traditional in all its features. The Repose on the Return from Egypt, freshly original in composition, coloring, and characterization. La Zingarelli, where the Virgin, leaning fondly over her babe, is drawn with full Correggian grace. And the Madonna adoring her child, which makes the infant the radiant source of the scene's illumination. His pagan turn came through an odd commission. In 1518, Giovanna da Piacenza, abbess of the convent of San Paolo in Parma, engaged him to decorate her apartment. She was a lady of more pedigree than piety. She chose as theme of the frescoes, Chaste Diana, goddess of the hunt, Over the fireplace, Correggio portrayed Diana in a splendid chariot. Above her, in 16 radial sections converging in the cupola, he painted scenes from classical mythology. In one, a dog, too passionately hugged by a child, expresses with a remarkably pictured eye his fear of being choked with love, and shames by his alert beauty all the human and divine figures scattered about. From this time forward, the human body, mostly nude, became for Correggio the chief element in pictorial decoration, and pagan motives entered into even his Christian themes. The abbess had converted him from Christianity. His success made a stir in Parma and brought him lucrative assignments. About 1519 he painted the mystic marriage of St. Catherine. The Virgin and the Saint here were unspeakably beautiful, and yet 4 years later Correggio surpassed them when he used the same subject for the picture that is one of the treasures of the Louvre. Lovely faces, an alluring landscape, the magic play of light and shade upon flowing raiment and waving hair. In 1520 Correggio accepted an arduous commission from Parma to paint frescoes in the cupola and over the tribune and side chapels of a new Benedictine abbey church, San Giovanni Evangelista. He toiled on this task for 4 years, and in 1523 he moved with his wife and children to Parma to be nearer his work. In the dome he represented the apostles, seated comfortably in a circle on soft clouds, fixing their gaze upon a Christ whose foreshortened figure, seen from below, gives an astonishing illusion of distance. The splendor of this dome is in the superbly modeled figures of the apostles, some of them quite nude, rivaling the gods of Phidias and perhaps echoing in their muscular splendor the figures that Michelangelo had painted on the Sistine Chapel ceiling 12 years before. In a spandrel between two arches, a powerful St. Ambrose discusses theology with an apostle John who is as handsome as any Parthenon Ephebus. Luscious youthful forms, theoretically angels, fill the interstices with angelic faces, buttocks, legs, and thighs. The Greek revival, already old in humanism and minutius, is here in full swing in Christian art. In 1522, the great cathedral of Parma opened its doors to the young artist and contracted to pay him 1,000 ducats, or $12,500, to paint the chapels, apse, choir, and dome. On this assignment he worked at intervals through 8 years, from 1526 till his death. For the dome he chose the Assumption of the Virgin and shocked many of the cathedral canons by making this culminating picture a whirling panorama of human flesh. In the center, the Virgin, reclining on the air, floats up to heaven with arms outstretched to meet her Son. Around and beneath her a heavenly host of apostles, disciples, and saints, magnificent figures worthy of Raphael at his best, seems to puff her upward with the breath of adoration, and supporting her is a choir of angels looking remarkably like healthy boys and girls in all the splendor of youthful nudity. These are the loveliest adolescent nudes in Italian art. One of the canons, confused by so many arms and legs, denounced the painting as a fricassee of frogs. Apparently other members of the chapter were dubious about this melee of human flesh celebrating a virgin, and Correggio's work on the cathedral seems to have been interrupted for a time. He was now, in 1530, advancing middle age and longed for the peace of a settled life. He bought some acres outside Correggio, became, like his father, a landed proprietor, and strove to support his family and his farm with his brush. During and after his major enterprises, he produced a series of religious pictures, almost every one of them masterly. Magdalene reading, the Virgin of St. Sebastian, the fairest virgin in Correggio, the Madonna della Scodella, with a bowl and an incomparable bambino, the Madonna di San Girolamo, sometimes called Il Giorno, or Day, in which the Jerome is worthy of Michelangelo, and the angel holding a book before the child is a vision of girlish beauty, and the Magdalene laying her cheek upon the child's thigh is the purest and tenderest of sinners, and the warm, rich reds and yellows make a canvas worthy of Titian at his best. And finally, a companion picture, the Adoration of the Shepherds, which fancy has called La Notte, or Night. What interested Correggio in these pictures was not the religious sentiment, but the aesthetic values, the adoring devotion of the young mother, herself so comely, with oval face, glossy hair, dropped eyelids, slender nose, thin lips, full bosom, or the masculine muscles of athletic saints, or the demure loveliness of Magdalene, or the rosy flesh of a child. Correggio, coming down from cathedral scaffolds, refreshed himself with composite visions of beauties that might be. About 1523, a series of commissions from Federigo II Gonzaga invited the full expression of the pagan element in his art. Wishing to court the favor of Charles V, the Marquis ordered picture after picture, sent them as gifts to the emperor, and received his coveted bauble, the title of duke. For him, schooled in the paganism of Rome, Correggio painted a succession of mythological subjects, commemorating Olympian triumphs of love or desire. In The Education of Eros, Venus blindfolds Cupid, lest the human race should die. In Jupiter and Antiope, the god, disguised as a satyr, advances upon the lady as she lies in naked slumber on the grass. In Danae, a winged herald prepares for Jupiter's coming by undraping the fair maid, while beside her bed two putti play in happy indifference to the morality of the gods. In Io, Jupiter descends from his boredom in a concealing cloud and clasps with omnipotent hand a plump lady who hesitates gracefully and ends by yielding to the compliment of desire. In The Rape of Ganymede, a pretty boy is flown to heaven by an eagle in haste to meet the needs of the ambidextrous god of gods. In Leda and the Swan, the lover is a swan, but the motive is the same. Even in The Virgin and St. George, two naked cupids romp before the Virgin, and St. George, in his flashing mail, is the physical ideal of Renaissance youth. We must not conclude that Correggio was merely a sensualist with a flair for painting flesh. He loved beauty, perhaps immoderately, and in these mythologies he stressed the surface of it too exclusively. But in his Madonnas he had done justice to a profounder beauty. He himself, while his brush romped through Olympus, lived like an orderly bourgeois, devoted to his family, and seldom leaving home except to work. He was content with little, Vasari tells us, and lived as a good Christian should. He is reported to have been timid and melancholy. Who would not be melancholy, coming every day into a world of deformed adults from a haunting dream of loveliness? Perhaps some quarrel arose about payment for the work in the cathedral. When Titian visited Parma, he heard echoes of the dispute and gave his opinion that if the dome could be inverted and filled with ducats, they would not adequately pay for what Correggio had painted there. In any case, the payments were curiously involved in the artist's premature death. In 1534 he received an installment of 60 crowns, all in coppers. Carrying this weight of metal, he set out from Parma on foot. He became overheated, drank too much water, took a fever, and died on his farm, March 5th, 1534, in the 40th, some say 45th, year of his age. For so short a life, his achievement was stupendous, far greater than all that Leonardo or Titian or Michelangelo or anyone but Raphael could show in their first 40 years. Correggio equals them all in grace of line, the soft modeling of contours, in portraying the living texture of human flesh. His coloring has a liquid and radiant quality, alive with reflections and transparencies, softer, with its violet, orange, rose, blue, and silver hues, than the glaring brilliance of the later Venetians. He was a master of chiaroscuro, of light and shade in their endless combinations and revelations. In some of his Madonnas, matter becomes almost a form and function of light. He experimented bravely with schemes of composition, pyramidal, diagonal, circular, but in his cupola frescoes he let unity slip through a superabundance of apostolic and angelic legs. He played too fondly with foreshortenings, so that the figures in his cupolas, though drawn as science might require, seem huddled and cramped and ungainly, like the ascending Christ of San Giovanni Evangelista. On the other hand, he cared nothing for mechanics, so that many of his characters, like Micawber, lack all visible means of support. He painted some religious subjects with exquisite tenderness, but his prevailing interest was in the body, its beauty, movements, attitudes, joys. And his later pictures symbolized the triumph of Venus over the Virgin in 16th-century Italian art. His influence in Italy and France was rivaled only by Michelangelo's. In the later 16th century, the Bolognese school of painting, led by the Carracci, took him as their model, and their followers, Guido Reni and Domenichino, founded upon Correggio an art of physical excellence and sensual sentiment. Charles Lebrun and Pierre Mignot imported into France and deployed in Versailles, a rosy, voluptuous style of decoration through pagan figures, darting cupids, and chubby cherubim. Correggio, rather than Raphael, conquered France, and left upon its art an influence that lasted till Watteau. In Parma itself, his work was continued and then transformed by Francesco Mazzuoli, called by Italian whim Il Parmigianino, the Parmesan. Born an orphan in 1504, he was reared by two uncles who were painters, so that his talent ripened rapidly. At 17, he was commissioned to decorate a chapel of that same church, San Giovanni Evangelista, in which Correggio was painting the dome. In these frescoes, his style achieved an almost Correggian grace, to which he added his own peculiar love of fine raiment. About this time, he painted a remarkable portrait of himself as seen in a mirror. This is one of the most engaging autoritratti in art, revealing a lad of refinement, sensitivity, and pride. When Parma was besieged by papal troops, his uncles packed up this and others of his pictures and sent Francesco with them to Rome in 1523 to study the works of Raphael and Michelangelo and seek the favor of Pope Clement VII. He was on the way to full success when the sack of Rome forced him to flee to Bologna in 1527. There, a fellow artist robbed him of all his engravings and designs. Presumably by this time his protective uncles had died. He earned his bread by painting for Pietro Aretino the queenly Madonna della Rosa, formerly in Dresden, and for some nuns the Santa Margherita, which still survives in Bologna. When Charles V came there to reorganize a devastated Italy, Francesco made a portrait of him in oils. The emperor liked it and might have made the artist's fortune, but Parmigianino took the portrait back to his studio to give it a few finishing touches and never saw Charles again. He returned to Parma in 1531 and received a commission to paint a vault in the church of the Madonna della Steccata. He was now at the top of his powers, and his incidental products were of a high order. A Turkish slave who looks more like a princess, a marriage of St. Catherine, matching Correggio's handling of this theme, with children of unearthly beauty, and an anonymous portrait, allegedly of his mistress Antea, described as one of the most famous courtesans of the time, but here angelically demure, with robes too gorgeous for anyone less than a queen. But now Parmigianino, perhaps goaded on by his misfortunes and poverty, became ardently interested in alchemy and neglected his painting to set up furnaces for the improvisation of gold. The ecclesiastics of San Giovanni, unable to recall him to his work there, ordered his arrest for violation of contract. The painter fled to Casalmaggiore, lost himself in alembics and crucibles, let his beard grow, neglected his person and his health, caught a chill and fever, and died as suddenly as Correggio in 1540. 2. Bologna. If we pass over Reggio and Modena in unseemly haste, it is not because they had no cherished heroes of sword or brush or pen. In Reggio, an Augustinian monk, Ambrogio Calipino, compiled a dictionary of Latin and Italian, which in successive editions grew into a polyglot lexicon of 11 languages, this in 1590. Little Carpi had a handsome cathedral designed by Baldassare Peruzzi in 1514. Modena had a sculptor, Guido Mazzoni, who shocked his townsmen by the realism of a terracotta Cristo Morto, and the 15th century choir stalls of the 11th century cathedral matched the beauty of the facade and campanile. Pellegrino da Modena, who worked with Raphael in Rome and then returned to his native city, might have become a painter of note had he not been murdered by ruffians bent upon killing his son. Doubtless Renaissance violence snuffed out in their growth a regiment of potential geniuses. Bologna, standing at a main crossing of Italy's trade routes, continued to prosper, though her intellectual leadership was passing to Florence as humanism dethroned scholasticism. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.